Hi folks, and welcome to the back half of Innovation and IP. And this back half will put the innovation into innovation and IP. You've already discussed IP with Dr. Owoye extensively in weeks 1 to 6, and now 7 to 12. We get to look at the fun stuff, the monetization issues around intellectual property. Just going to do a quick overview with our presentation here. Well, why do we need to know about the regulatory context of innovation? Good place to start. If you are going to be in the business of commercialising your intellectual property, you really need to know a little bit, at least, about the regulatory context, because the way that the government handles innovation and its policies surrounding the stimulation of business investment in innovation has a direct bearing on the kinds of funding that an innovator might be able to secure when they are looking at starting off on the commercialisation route. So we particularly need to know a little bit about how the government has traditionally viewed innovation, and some fairly interesting developments about how the government views innovation and the kinds of policies that are likely to come out very shortly. So that's a bit of a teaser for you. Let's get into looking at rationales, because that's the first place to start, really. So you recall in week 1, you had a good old look at the justifications and rationales for having an intellectual property rights system. And one of the predominant rationales that keeps popping up here, there and everywhere is a market failure argument. And this is quite an interesting little argument. As you recall, basically just says, look, you know what, due to its non-rivalrous and easily duplicatable nature, intellectual property is ripe as a source of market failure, because if any inventor or creator puts their works or invention out into the marketplace, it's going to be often quite easy for imitators to get out there, seize their creation or their invention, reverse engineer it or whatever they want to do, and get it out onto the market and compete with the innovator and steal their market value, to basically free ride off the coattails of the creator or the innovator. That rationale also applies when you're talking about the broader notion of innovation. So innovation is the umbrella term that we use for the whole process of creating an invention or creation, and then moving it along to the development stage, and then moving it on to the commercialisation and dissemination or diffusion stages. So it's that, I guess you could conceptualise it, certainly the free marketeers do, you could conceptualise innovation as a pipeline, if you will. So securing your intellectual property rights starts at the beginning of that pipeline, and then you might get others involved in order to work up the invention and scale it, get it out to the marketplace. So that's what I'm very broadly calling the process of innovation. Now, the market failure justification, as I said, sits in quite nicely with the broader process of innovation, just as much as it does with the whole justification for providing a system of IP rights. And it sits within a broader policy paradigm that's based in neoclassical economics. Don't go to sleep just yet. And that is the free market paradigm. That's where the individuals compete on the market as rational maximisers, always trying to maximise their own personal profit making from their ventures on the market. It's all about free competition. It's all about robust competition in order to stimulate the best value not only for the competitors in the market but also for society as a whole economically. In the free market policy paradigm, you'll find that the government tends to take a very hands-off approach to stimulating business investment in innovation. It really leaves it to the primacy of the rule of law rather than the government getting in partnership with industry or in partnership with innovators. So you tend to see things like broad-based incentives, funding incentives that apply to all innovators in the market, because a free market policy paradigm would say that if you're going to actually use specific policies targeted at specific technology or specific sectors within the wider innovation sector, then what you're doing is you're picking winners, and that will distort the competition in the market. So it's a big kind of no-no for free marketeers to actually engage in specific targeted initiatives, policy initiatives, funding initiatives that are strategically focused at a particular set of recipients. Okay, so that's the general flavour, if you will, of a free market approach to innovation policy. Now, the one justification, as I said, is if there's a market failure. So if the government can see that there is a particular problem on the market and it's gone from a state of, and they do, free marketers do assume a generally perfect state of competition in any given market because of the competition. If there is some kind of hiccup in that process and there is a market failure, then the policy paradigm rooted in this free market idea says, oh, well, that's okay, we can intervene now because all we're doing is we're giving the market a push back to its equilibrium, and then the market forces will take over again, competition will take over, and it'll all be good. Okay, so it's kind of like a series of static states of, perfect competition. It'll find a hiccup, and then the government will step in with some kind of policy initiative, and then it'll go on its way again for a while, and then there might be another kind of market failure. Now, what is a market failure? A market failure is where there is underinvestment in a particular activity because for some reason or other, the actors or the competitors in that area see an economic disincentive for engaging in that activity. And that's the case sometimes with innovation, particularly in terms of research and development. So that's R&D. If you see me using my slides, if you see me using the shorthand R&D, that's just research and development. So particularly with collaborative research and development, historically, over the past 40-odd years, Australia has been a bit of a laggard in this area, and we come last or near last. We've been slipping gradually in all of the global indicators, the metrics that measure research and development collaboration between business and the research sector, so higher education, non-profit research centres and that kind of thing. We don't do terribly well in collaborative R&D. Now, as I say in the study guide, there are some stellar exceptions to that. The biotechnology industry is, one of the flagship R&D collaboration activities within Australia. There's also a lot of good collaborative R&D that sits within the Commonwealth Government's Cooperative Research Centres, CRCs. These are little bubbles, I guess, R&D bubbles that the Commonwealth Government has set up. There's quite a number of them. And they are usually for particular projects. And that's where I guess the government has been pouring in some of its initiatives to stimulate collaborative R&D. So because we've had this paucity of collaborative R&D over the last, as I said, about 40-odd years, the government has been pumping in money to try and stimulate business investment in collaborative R&D. Because, why is that? Collaborative R&D is the kind of activity that is likely to lead to inventions and creations. And then you're right at the very beginning of the pipeline, aren't you? So if you're incentivizing collaborative R&D, what you're doing is you're hoping to grow the number of inventions, and then hopefully they will get taken along that pipeline that the free marketeers think of towards the end stage then, where you're commercializing, and then everybody's getting the benefit. You're getting the inventors getting their profit, you're getting the society having the benefit of the invention or the creation, everyone's happy. It's utopia. This kind of free market paradigm has been around basically since the Howard government in the 80s, and it is the driving force behind the National Innovation and Science Agenda. That got going in 2015. I will leave you to read all about it in the study guide, and that is the free market paradigm. Then we have the interventionist policy paradigm, and this kind of policy paradigm has been around even before Howard's government's time. It had its heyday in the early 80s with Bob Hawke's government, when they were doing a massive restructuring of the Australian economy, and the industrial policy of that era really was all about dismantling our old tariff system, trying to introduce a decent level of competition into the market within Australia. And so what they did was they had a series of initiatives called the button plans, and the button plans were designed to, as I said, restructure industry, make it more competitive. There were certainly some winners here. Remember how I said the free marketeers don't like picking winners? There were certainly some winners with the button plans in the early 80s, and there were some losers. But the good thing about, I guess, the interventionist policy of the 80s that had this massive industrial restructuring project kind of driving it was that, being a Labor government, I suppose, they were also very mindful of the losers that lost out from this policy paradigm. And so there were measures put in place for example, displaced labour, for those industries that weren't benefiting from the initiatives that were being, the strategic initiatives that were being handed down from the government at that time. The latest report to come out from what's now called Industry, Innovation and Science Australia and the Australian Government, the Department of Industry, is a report called Stimulating Business Investment in Innovation, and that marks a really important change. Well, it could mark a really important change in the way that the government anchors the narrative in its innovation policy. As I said, the free market paradigm has been going for about 40 odd years, ever since Hawke's era, that very early 80s era. Then it turned to free marketeer policies, and they've largely dominated. There's been a little bit of strategic policy going on, but largely free market approach to innovation policy since Howard's time. And Innovation and Science Australia is an independent body that was set up by the government in order to provide the government with advice on, you guessed it, surprise, surprise, innovation. And it's had a number of reports over the years. It was set up, I'm going to say, in about late 2015 or 2016. Its first report was released in 2017, and that was called the Australia 2030 report. And unfortunately for ESA, that was fairly spectacularly unsuccessful, and the government really only adopted about half of the recommendations that it proposed the government should take to stimulate investment in innovation. So fast forward now to 2020, and the Stimulating Business Investment in Innovation report was released February 2020, so just kind of before the effects of COVID hit Australia. And they basically mounted an argument that, you know, come on now, guys, everybody else in the world is looking more closely at interventionist policy. We need to start thinking about strategically investing in innovation to drive it where we want it to go. So it's not good enough just having those broad-based policy initiatives like, for example, as I said, the R&D tax incentive, which applies to everybody in the marketplace that's doing R&D. You need to drive an agenda here, and their agenda is quite an interesting one. They're particularly keen on pushing the digital technology space. And as I said, the big argument there is everybody's doing it. What are the pros of interventionist policy? Well, as I said, everyone's doing it. There is a good amount of evidence that the latest ESA report actually that's come out, so 1 year after the Stimulating Business Investment in Innovation report, this latest one that's been released in January of 2021, that one is basically just, it tries to assist the government in working out how it might go about doing its strategic investment in innovation. And it's, as I said, scraped up quite a number of, you know, nice looking statistics that say, you know, everybody else is doing it, why can't we? It has its genesis in strategic trade theory, which basically says, given that Australia is such a small economy, we really need to focus on core areas of strength so that we can pool our resources and compete more effectively on the global stage. The free marketeers kind of have shot that down in various ways, and I'll leave you to read my article on that, see if you're convinced or unconvinced. But the pro here, obviously, is that it's going to be much easier for the government to drive innovation activity towards certain priority areas. And if that's what the government really wants to do, then this is probably the most sensible way to do it. Also, the R&D, the very broad-based incentives like the R&D tax incentive, bear in mind, currently the R&D tax incentive comprises about 96% of the government's spending on trying to get business into this business of R&D collaboration. So, query, if you want to drive innovation towards particular sectors or particular technologies, is that really the best way to do it? Possibly not. So we might be able to, and this is what I think the Stimulating Business Investment in Innovation report's hinting at, shave back that R&D tax incentive, save some dollars there, and use those to stimulate the areas that we want innovation to happen in. So potentially cheaper for the government, possibly also more agile, because, you know, really big policy initiatives like the R&D TI tax incentive are very cumbersome to set up, and they are designed to be very, very long term. So possibly if you have a suite of initiatives that are strategically targeted, they might be more agile. And if they're not working, you can kind of cull them off. If they are working, maybe you can siphon some more money into them. So that's some of the pros. What we might do now is, now that I've got you hanging for the cons, what we might do is leave this video here because it's past that 20-odd minute mark, and we'll come back and we'll do video 2. So until then, bye for now, guys.